Hello everybody, my name is Andrew Trollson, and I'm going to give you a quick 5-minute overview of the Complete C# class. So when it comes to course objectives, the first thing that we're going to be making sure that everyone feels comfortable with is to really understand the scope of the .NET platform. What can it do, what can I do with it, and what sorts of software can I build? We'll also talk about the platform independence of the .NET platform and a bunch of common development tools. We'll also be talking about the details of the .NET type system. So we'll be talking about classes, interfaces, structures, enums, and delegates, probably one of the more confounding parts of the platform. We'll make sure that attendees feel comfortable with the distinction between an assembly, a namespace, and a type, and how we work with those three concepts in the context of Visual Studio. Of course, we'll be focusing on building object-oriented software, so encapsulation, inheritance, polymorphism. We'll learn all about the role of generics and the benefits that they bring to the software that you write. We'll be taking a pretty deep dive into the actual format of a .NET assembly. We'll learn about what the manifest is used for and how the CLR reads it at runtime. We'll talk about assembly metadata, and we'll also talk just a little bit about the mother tongue of .NET, IL. We'll talk about versioning and deployment of assemblies, and that will entail a discussion of XML configuration files, as well as private and shared assemblies. Now we're also going to be talking about a number of core APIs in the class, and the first big API that we're going to be looking at is called reflection. And in this chapter we have a lot of related topics too, such as dynamic loading, late binding, and how we could construct custom attributes and why we might want to do so. That's the follow-up to the reflection chapter. And then we're going to start to shift gears and talk about some user interface development. We'll be looking at UI development in terms of Windows Forms, and our first look is going to be with object serialization. We'll be talking about how we can persist out objects. We have a whole dedicated chapter just on Windows Forms all by itself. And of course we'll be talking about relational database programming using ADO.NET. We have 2 chapters on that. And then we wrap up the week with a discussion on website development using ASP.NET. Now, we do assume that people that come to the class have some basic prerequisites. Of course, everybody's welcome, but people will succeed if you're prepared to do a lot of programming. Okay? This course gives you a few labs where we give you a little bit of starter code, but pretty much every lab is going to be a nice, clean, fresh project where we just start pounding out the details of the lab. We'll be able to reuse code in future labs, but again, it is a programming intensive course. We assume that you have comfort working with graphical IDEs. It doesn't have to be Visual Studio, but something in that general ballpark. The more experience you have with OO, the better. We don't assume that you're an expert by any stretch, and we don't assume that you've done any C#. But if you have some familiarity with, what's a class, what do classes let me do, that'll be helpful. If you don't have that background, no problem. We'll just make sure that we spend a little extra time there in the 3rd chapter. Some understanding of XML is definitely helpful when we start to talk about configuring assemblies. As you might know, that's all done through an XML configuration file. And we have 2 chapters that focus on relational database programming, but this is not a class on SQL query optimization. You don't have to be any kind of a SQL guru, but just that you understand the basics of, table data, some basic SQL commands that will help you during the ADO.NET part of the class. Now, this course is a kind of a combination of lecture and demo and lab time. And those are just some very rough numbers. Every class will be a little different based on the needs of the attendees, but you can kind of assume that maybe about 60% of your time will be spent listening to lecture and doing interactive demos with the trainer. and then about 40% of the time we'll be working on labs. And of course we have solutions provided for all labs, so you're certainly free to consult that. Here's a breakdown of the actual content from the class, kind of chapter by chapter. The first 4 chapters of the class give everyone a really firm foundation in doing OO with C#, as well as the .NET type system. So chapter 4, that's going to be a variety of important topics that kind of round out your understanding, like the relationship between delegates and events, for example. We'll be talking about generics and assemblies, as mentioned. Chapter 7 is where we start to learn how to build really extensible software using some more sophisticated APIs. And as you can see, we round out the week there with the discussion on ADO.NET, Windows Forms, File I/O, and we wrap it all up with a discussion on ASP.NET. Now, when it comes to what an attendee will need to take the course, thankfully the requirements are pretty simple. We use Visual Studio 2010 for all the lab work, so if you have a copy of that, you'll be just fine. When you install Visual Studio 2010, SQL Server Express is also installed, and for what we're going to do in class, that will be fine. But if you have a full installation of SQL Server, all the better. And when it comes to working with the web component of the lab, you don't have to have a configuration of IIS, because we're going to be using the ASP Development Web Server, so all you have to bring is your browser of choice. So you can see that the requirements for the actual computer setup are pretty low impact. So that's a quick overview of what's happening in the Complete C# class, and hope to see you there.